1 minute.
The camera is rolling, so we are ready when you are.
So hello everyone, this is Drupal 8's multilingual APIs building for the entire world. We are going to go through code, not about site building. If you are interested on the site building parts of Drupal 8 multilingual, we've been holding sessions in the last years about how to build sites, multilingual sites in Drupal 8. In cons and camps, and in Drupal 8 multilingual.org you can find videos and even a workshop, a 3-hour workshop where we cover everything you need for building multilingual sites in Drupal 8. And there's also a multilingual demo distribution that you can check out. And if you are here for the day, later on today, there's in the room Calibrate, Tom Robert is talking about setup tips and tricks for Drupal 8 multilingual for user experience, and he will probably cover quite a lot on site building experience. So my name is Cristian Lopez. I'm penyaskito on Drupal.org, and I've been working on Drupal 8 multilingual initiative, contributing things there. And in Drupal 7, if you have you built Drupal 7 multilingual sites? Hands up. Yeah, so more than half of the room. In Drupal 7, multilingual was an afterthought, so it wasn't that well integrated in Drupal core. So people had to build country modules that improved that, like the I18N module. And we wanted to make the experience of building Drupal 8 multilingual sites better. So for that, there was a lot of people who was contributing to this initiative, and they contributed more than 1,500 contributed reviews, user testing, screenshots, UIs, tests, and any kind of feedback. And the list goes on. So this is a lot of people. So thanks to them for building this. So summarizing a bit, in Drupal 7 we had Drupal core was not that aware of language, and then we had the locale module, which adds a list of languages and UI translations, and it worked with PO files, so you had to download the PO files and import them on your site, and if you had like 50 country modules, you have to download 50 PO files for each language. So if you have 3 languages, you have to download and import manually 150 files, which is not good. So then the community built the Lion localization update module, which allows you to automate this task. And then you want to translate your content, so you have the content translation modules, which supports nodes, and you can translate your nodes by creating copies of them. But you also have menu items and taxonomy terms and other stuff that you want to translate. So then you need the I18N suite that allows you to translate those. But you cannot translate your site name still, so you need the variable module. And And then, if you want to build a commerce site, you need the entity translation module for translating your shop items. And with the entity translation module, you can translate your nodes too. But you cannot translate the titles, so you need the title module too. So at the end, you have like several country modules or core modules for translating content. And you can use all of them on your site. Maybe you want to use some of them for some content and others for other content. So it can easily be a mess. And we wanted to improve this situation. And in Drupal 7, this was an afterthought. But in Drupal 8, we really thought about how to make language part of Drupal core. And this was based on 4 pillars. If you were in Jam's keynote before, you are familiar with these slides. So the first one is the language, which allows to which provides base services for dealing with the language your data is on, no matter if it's a multilingual site or a monolingual site. Then you have the interface translation module, which was tied to the locale module in Drupal 7. But in Drupal 8, you may want to have different languages on your site, but maybe you don't want to translate your UI, so now it's support. And it already has the feature of auto-downloading your translations and importing them, which is really useful. Then you have the content translation module, which provides based on field translation, so it's more like entity translation was in Drupal 7. But it's called content translation, so it can be a bit confusing. And it allows to translate not only your nodes, but any kind of entity of content that you have on your site. So you can translate your taxonomy terms or anything else, and it's like the same interface. And it provides the interface for translating that content. And the fourth pillar is the config translation module, which the config initiative is quite something new in Drupal 8. So you can store and you can actually have your configuration in code, which you can deploy to different environments. And the config translation module allows to translate this kind of config. So if you have your views, you can translate your views or anything in a unified UI. So it's the same UI that you will have for any kind of content there. So the first of these pillars is the language one, and we are going to see how the APIs there work. So the language module allows to store the language your data is on. And in Drupal core, we have a service for handling your languages, which is the language manager. So you can call Drupal language manager, and you get a language manager, which allows you to manage the languages on your site. But if you don't have the local module, you still have language information, because we want to track which language your data is on. By default, Drupal will assume that it's English if you install without the locale module. And if you call the Drupal language manager method, you will get the language manager object. But if you have locale enabled and you call this method, you will get the configurable language manager, which has the abilities to actually handle different languages. So this manager, if you can work with your languages with its methods. And if you are using the locale module, you are not using the locale module, and you call the get languages, you will have 3 languages. We have 2 special languages in Drupal 8. In Drupal 7, we had 1, the undefined, not specified language. And it was quite confusing for people what this language is for. So we decided to introduce another one for make people more confused. And now we have the UND for not specified language, and the set XX for not applicable. So these are undefined languages. If you have on your site, you want people to upload text files, but they maybe don't know which language these texts are in, you will use the not specified language. And if you have people uploading image which contains no text, then language doesn't really make sense there, so you would use the not applicable language. And by default, Drupal will assume that your content is in English. But if you enable the locale, the language module, you will have the ability to add new languages. So in this case, we will have like Hungarian and Italian. And calling the getLanguage method will return these language objects, and you can, which are config entities, so they are stored on your config, on your active config, and you can export them and import them anywhere in other environments. And we have the other two languages still, but they are locked, so they are not shown in most UIs. But if you export them, you will see that you can actually create new locked language if you need to track something else with languages. So it's quite flexible system. And for creating your languages, you can do that through the API, of course. And Drupal has a list of 95 standard languages. So if you want to create them on your site, you can use this shortcut method, create from lang code, and pass the lang code. And if this lang code is one of the standard language lang code, it will get the name of your language and the native name of your language from there. But you can also define your own language if you want to use the configurable language constructor. You can just call it and pass the language you want to use in case you want to maybe have different locales or something. And it will work the same you work with any other config entity. So you can just create this from lang code and call save, and this language will be saved on your system. In the same way, you can load them and edit them and delete them through the APIs. And the language module also contains detection, so you can configure in the UIs how you want to select the language the page should be displayed on. And from the APIs, if you need to access this language, you will use the getCurrentLanguage object, the getCurrentLanguage method on your language manager, and this will return the language object of the current language of your UI. So now that we've seen how you can deal with languages and do CRUD operations with them, it's or get the language negotiated. Next thing would be how to translate your user interface. So if you are creating your own modules, you will probably know the T function. And like in this 7, we have the T function, and it's what 90% of people will use, and they don't really need to know the difference between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. But actually, it's quite different from Drupal 7. So another thing we need to introduce is the dependency injection concept. Maybe you are aware of this way. So dependency injection is a concept that allows us to explicitly define the dependencies your code has. So before, you call just the T function anywhere on your code and you get the translation of that string. But now you better want to know that your code depends on the T function. So we have in Drupal 8 this concept called services, and we want that if our services depend on other services, we want to know this dependency. So what we do is like we inject these services onto your service. So you can then do a lot of great things, like for testing, you can mock them, and this makes your code like more consistent, and you can find which code your code depends on. So then, instead of calling T function, now we should do this T, And if we are in a module file, we still have to use the T function. But if we are in a controller or a form and we are extending from form base or controller base, we want to use this T. And we have to store a reference to the service. But for that, we can use the string translation trait, which already provides this reference to the translation service. And we have the T method there, so you can just use the string translation trait and then call this T, and it will be fine. And if you are already extending from form base or controller base, this is already in there, so you don't really need to worry about it. But it's good to know if you're defining your own services. And internally, T is quite different, so we are not really getting a translation string, but we can call methods to this to the output of the T function, because we are getting a translatable markup wrapper around this string. And this is great because it makes possible to ask this object about things like in which language this string will be printed. We can alter those, or we can just, and they are not translated until they are really rendered. So if maybe you are not in your code, you are later modifying it or altering your form or whatever, your string won't be translated at all, so you are not really wasting operations on doing this translation itself if they are not going to be rendered in the final HTML. And for plurals, we have the same. In Drupal 7, we had the format plural method. Now we don't even have it anymore, so you have to call this format plural, and it's part of the string translation trait. So it's just the same that T. If you are using JavaScript, creating your JavaScript files, you will have also Drupal T and Drupal format plural, and they work the same. And now that we have TWIO in core as the default templating system, we also, in Drupal 7, you had PHP templates, so you just call T and that's all. In TWIO, we need a way of actually translating strings that we may want to have on our template. And we have two different methods for that. The first one is the trans filter. So if you have like this input and you have a placeholder and you want to have the string there and translate it, you just put the trans filter on your string. But if you have like you are passing more parameters to the trans filter, or you have like a different context, you want to pass a context for passing which language you want the string to be rendered or anything, it's more readable to use the trans tag, which is the one you can find on Node.HTML TWIO. And this is just using trans and entrans, and the text you put between those tags, they will be calling the T function when the templates are compiled. So you can use variables there or whatever. So in Drupal 7, we had our hue menus, and there you shouldn't be using T, because then you cannot cache the menu items. Now in Drupal 8, we have the menu YAML links menu YAML files, and we have the same situation, but in this case they are YAML files, so you cannot call any function. So we do the same that we used to do before, but now it's more explicit. You just have the title and the description there, and they will be translated. Drupal core will translate those, and you will have these strings for translation on the string translation page. So if you are writing your own links menu, you just have to write the text in English, and you will find the way of translating in the user interface. So now we can translate our interface from English to whatever other language we have. We have to still write our strings in English on our code and our YAML files. And next step would be translating your content. So for creating your entities, you have this is from core, it's the node entity. You have the content entity type annotation. And there you can define different attributes like the ID, the label, the entities keys you will use. And for making your entities translatable, you need to define the translatable key attribute and define it as true. And then in your entity keys, you need to define the lang code. And that's it. If you are starting from content entity base, that's everything you have to do. If you are using, and you can get the lang code field from there, so everything is set up for you. And when you define your base field definitions on your entity, with the base field definitions method, you there need to define if your field definitions are translatable or not with the set translatable method. And this, so you have to explicitly say this on your base fields, but if you are using the field UI and you add fields there, they will be translatable by default. But you have the option on the interface to mark them as if you want them to be translatable or not, but by default they will be. But here you have to explicitly say if you want them to be translatable or not. And if you are creating your own fields, because we have data types in Drupal 8 for defining them, this will just be translatable out of the box. But still, if you have like fields that are composed by different columns, like for example the image field, you have the possibility of making your fields translatable on a more fine-grained base. And you can use the column groups, and there you can group columns. Like in the case of the image, you have the file with the target ID, the width and the height of your image. And you want to have those together and not translatable because you don't want to translate your files. But then you have your alt text and your title text, and in this case you probably want to translate them. So by default you mark them as translatable, but the user still has the ability of disable them for translation or not. So this is how you define your entities and your fields to be translatable, and then how do you work with the translations themselves. So your entities will have a getTranslation method, so you can pass the lang code of the translation you want to get and operate with them. Or you can also, if you have your node, in your page, the page you are rendering, you already have a context. So which language the user requested this page on, which language was negotiated. So you have the getTranslation from context in the entity storage repository. So you can call that one, and it will get the proper translation that should be shown in the page you are in, based on the negotiated language. And your entities are actually clever objects, so they know things about language, so you can get the translated version of your node. So you get the source node, or you can call the language method and get the language this node is in, or the current translation is in, or you can call and check which languages this node is translated to, so you can call the node getTranslation language method, or ask if there's a translation, add a new translation, or you can remove translations from the APIs. And yeah, So you can do whatever you need with translation, so you will still get another node interface object, which actually contains the translation. And this is the same for any kind of content entities that you are using. So if you have a taxonomy term, it will be exactly the same. If you created your own entities, they will work the same. If you extend from content entity base, you will get all of these for free. So as we saw, you can translate it from any language. So you have any content you can translate to any other language on your site, and these are intelligent objects. So you can call methods on them and get the proper translations or create new translation or everything. And next pillar is the config translation. So for config translation, these are actually saved on YAML files. And you can export them to YAML files, and they contain the language these config objects are in. So in this case, we have the system maintenance text, and it has the line code associated with it. And this line code comes from the config schemas. So in Drupal 8, we wanted to know how to translate your configuration, and then the community came with the config schemas concept, which actually has been used for a lot more things like validation. But it was created initially just for knowing which parts of a config object or a config entity can be translatable or not. And there we have data types in Drupal core, and in the data type schema, you can find the definition of this data. So if you create a config object, you know that they will be a complex object with maps different attributes with values. And one of these attributes will be a lang code, which is a string. And then you have other kind of data types like a text, and there you will find that it's a string, that it's translatable. So you can create your own data types just by creating your schema. So another example is for this maintenance config object. We will define it as a config object. So this means that it will have a language already. It will have a lang code property. And you can define the message as a text. So this will make Drupal know that this is a translatable string. So then the config translation module can even create the translation interface for translating your config objects, and this is quite cool. So if you have your own module which is providing config, you don't really need to care about how you translate those configurations, because the config translation module is able of creating these forms if you define your schema. So when in your site, you will have this config. If you export your configuration in your site, you will have the system maintenance YAML file, and if you translate it, you will have a language folder, which will contain a folder for each of your languages, and there you will have like another version of this YAML file with only the properties that you are overriding in this language. So if you have your Hungarian in your site, you will have a languages, the lang code, and then the system maintenance YAML file, and the same for any other language that you have. And if you want to load these objects from your code, you can just call the Drupal config method and pass the key. And this will get, so here what you get is the object which with all the overrides applied. So if you have, if you call Drupal config, you will get a config object which already has, if you are in a different language on your context, you will have the overrides from languages, And even if you are overriding things on settings PHP or whatever, they will be applied here. So what you have here is the config your site should be using. And there you can call methods for getting the data from the config, like get message in the case of the maintenance text. But you can also do other stuff, like if you use you can call the language manager and get the language, and then you can, in the language manager, you can get the config override itself. So you can set which config override you want to use, and then calling the Drupal config method will return the config for that language, no matter with which language your page was negotiated on. And then you can, you should set the config override language to your original language. So you can, if you are visiting a page in Italian, but you want to use the German configuration because maybe you are using that for sending emails to a user that set up German to be the default language they want to use for emails, then you can still do that by using this. And there are other methods for accessing your config. So if you call the Drupal config, you get your config with all the overrides already applied. You can call the config factory and call the getEditable method there, which has no overrides. So if you have overrides from different languages, or you are creating your overrides on settings PHP, they won't be applied here. So you will get actually the object which is saved. And you can actually create your own overrides for languages. So you can call the get language config override and pass the lang code you want to get and the config name that you want to get, and then you can call the set method or whatever and save. So you can actually access the override itself. So in the case of content, we could translate all the languages from any language, source language to any target language, and they were intelligent objects. But in the case of config, it's you can also translate from any language to any other languages, but you are actually getting DAM arrays, so they are not. You really have to use the language manager or for actually managing stuff there. And yeah, so those are the 4 pillars in Drupal 8, and this is a quick review of the Drupal 8 APIs. So as I said before, this is the job of a lot of people. So please send them if you find them in any event. And that's it. Questions? So I was so clear that there are no questions, or coffee didn't make any effect? Okay, so in case you come with questions later, I'll be around today and tomorrow, so just drop by if you want to ask, and I'll be happy to try to help. Thank you so much. And thanks to the sponsors that made this possible, and thanks to the organizers too. So, thanks.